America is famous for a lot of things. A lot of great things like football, movie stars, hot dogs, national parks, and being a land of opportunity. But on the flip side, the US is also the birthplace of roughly 67% of recorded worldwide. Welcome back, most amazing crew. I'm your host Kennedy, and today we're talking about some of the scariest criminals in America ever. And I won't lie, the people on this list are so messed up that you might even wish you'd never learned about them to begin with. Let's go. Starting us off at number 10 is Gein Toppan. Likely responsible for nearly 31 deaths, Gein, or Jolly Gein as she's often referred to, had a very unique motive: to have more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. She came from a very abusive household, and after her mother's death, she and her sisters were given up to an orphanage. Now, not much is known about what went on during her time there, but just 2 years after she was admitted, she was hired as a servant for a family in Massachusetts. As an adult, Gein began studying nursing and was well liked as a hospital, but soon she began fixating on elderly and sick patients and began using them as test subjects for morphine and atropine injections, as she was interested in what it would do to their nervous systems. Upon her arrest, she was coined an angel of death, as she reported that she would poison her victims before laying down with them and fondling their helpless bodies until they passed. She said she derived pleasure from the patients on the brink of death and felt as though she could see the inner workings of their souls through their eyes. Although at first her victims were elderly and sick, she began to poison more recklessly friends, family, and even her housekeeper. During trial, she insisted on being declared sane as she wanted the possibility of release, but the jury ruled her unfit for trial and had her committed to an institution where she remained until her death in 1938. Next up at number 9 is Rodney Alcala. During the late 70s, Rodney came into the public eye after appearing on the TV show The Dating Game, but what America didn't know was that he was actually a cold-blooded killer. It's kind of wild that he managed to get on the show in the first place, because he'd already had a pretty hefty criminal history, having already been one of America's most wanted fugitives for several kidnappings of young girls, as well as a few suspected killings. But I guess they just didn't really do much of a background check for the contestants. At the time, fellow contestants thought he was very strange and creepy, but still he won the competition and a date with the Bachelorette. However, she too felt something was wrong with him, so refused to go on a date, and authorities believe that was what might have thrown Rodney over the edge. He began kidnapping at a much higher rate, inviting unsuspecting girls and boys to his house to model for him. Once he got them to his house, he would take them into his photo room and force them to take explicit photos before taking advantage of them and ending their lives. Finally, authorities caught on to him, and upon his 1979 arrest, they uncovered more than 1,000 photographs linking him to a suspected 130 victims. Officially, he was convicted for 8 and sentenced to death, but died of natural causes before the day came. Next up at number 8 is Albert Fish. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish was a terrifying killer responsible for the death of 3 people in the mid-1920s, although according to him it was well over 100. Fish grew up in an unstable home. Both his parents suffered from mental illness, and after his father died, he was sent to live in an orphanage. While there, he was abused by the other orphans, but he started to develop a rather confusing feeling towards the pain. He began to enjoy it. As Fish got older, he started seeking darker and more twisted things to feel alive, and soon that led to the kidnapping, taking advantage of, and subsequent devouring of. Thankfully, the monster was caught in 1935, and shockingly, he wasted no time denying his atrocities. In fact, he almost seemed proud of them. I can't, and frankly won't go into detail about what he did, but it is some of the most disgusting stuff I've ever read about. Eventually, Fish was sentenced to death and died by electric chair in 1936, and after his death, his lawyer refused to release his statement, saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Next up at number 7 is Robert Hansen. Known in the media as the Butcher Baker, Hansen was an extremely sick who quite literally viewed his victims as prey. In his adolescence, Robert was an awkward and shy boy who had absolutely no luck with girls. These early rejections festered into a deep hatred for women, for which he would later seek revenge. As he got older, he began finding solace in archery and hunting, and would routinely spend his time perfecting his craft alone in the woods. Then, in the early 1960s, he began seeking revenge, at first by committing arson on his high school property, but then soon turning to seek revenge on women specifically. By 1971, he was kidnapping and taking advantage of women, but not yet. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years for his crimes, but after just 6 months was released on a work program. After his release was where it got really scary. He began kidnapping women and escorts, taking them back to his apartment where he would do awful things to their bodies before flying them out to secluded areas in the wilderness and telling them that he was going to hunt them down and kill them. Tragically, an estimated 21 women lost their lives to this monster, but thankfully he was convicted and sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. Coming in at number 6, we have Henry Lee Lucas. Active between 1960 to 1983, Lucas was a convicted responsible for the death of at least 3 people, one of which was his own mother. Lucas and his mother had a very relationship. In his early years, she worked as an escort and would force Lucas to watch her in the act, often forcing him to cry as well so she could to her clients. Then in 1949, Lucas's father passed away, and shortly after he dropped out of school and ran away from home. After a stint in prison for burglary, he was released in 1959 before reconnecting with his family. Soon he was visited by his mother and told her of his new fiancé he had met through pen pal while being locked up. But his mother didn't approve and wanted him to move back in with her and take care of her. Then one night in a heated argument, she struck him with a broom before he stabbed her through the neck and fled the scene. Lucas was promptly convicted for the crime and sentenced to 40 years, but after only 10 years away, they released him due to overcrowding. From there, it only got worse. Lucas was a man on the run and started kidnapping and taking advantage of at a disgusting rate, one of which was his own daughter, as well as the daughter of fellow convicted felon Otis Toole. Eventually, he was caught for his crimes and sentenced to death after confessing to 600 killings. And although his claim of 600 was never taken to heart, it is likely that the number was very high and no one really knows just how many people he harmed for sure. Coming in at number 5, Adolfo Constanzo. Active during the late 1980s, Adolfo was a brutal and cult leader responsible for the death of a suspected 26 people. Early on, Adolfo was introduced to voodoo, occult, and palo mayombe, and began to develop an interest in animal sacrifice for ritualistic purposes. Once an adult, he moved to Mexico City, where he started a business performing his sacrifices for clients looking to receive good luck. Many of his clients were involved in high-ranking cartels, and he even began to make friends with corrupt officers. Soon enough, the sacrificing of animals wasn't satiating his needs, and so he began to exhume bodies, thinking that their bones held more power than that of an animal. But soon enough, he and his cult decided that committing human sacrifices would provide even more power, and so the brutality began. The cult 20 people mutilating their bodies for power, but soon even that wasn't enough. Constanzo decided he needed an incredible brain to reach his peak. He ordered his henchmen to abduct a pre-med student named Mark Kilroy, who they brought back, sacrificing him and taking out his brain carefully before adding it to their pile of human sacrifices. Eventually, police got word of the cult and set out to raid the ranch, but Adolfo fled with 4 of his followers to a nearby apartment. Police tracked him down, and Adolfo, determined not to go to prison, ordered his henchmen to him then themselves before the police could enter the apartment. As Adolfo was dead when they arrived, he was never charged, but 14 of the high-ranking cult members were convicted of a range of crimes, most serving upwards of 30 years in prison. Coming in at number 4 is Gary Ridgway. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led him to wetting his bed well into his teen years. After each incident, his mother would clean him up, which led Gary to have very conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about her and then doing unspeakable things to her corpse. When he got older, he joined the military, and although he was married, it was during this time in combat that he started to become obsessed with escorts. Once he returned back to America, his first marriage ended quite quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon after he married again, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations, both with his wife and with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires and started strangling the women after he had got what he wanted from them, dumping their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods at the time. She didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found buried in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said that he had so many that he'd lost count, and that even he didn't know the real number anymore. Thankfully, the monster was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility for parole, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 3 is Richard Trenton Chase. Often referred to as the Vampire of Sacramento, Chase was a truly terrifying killer who took the life of 6 people in just 1 month back in 1977. Before he turned to human victims, Chase would capture animals before bringing them back to his apartment to kill and disembowel. From there, he would eat them raw, sometimes mixing them with Coca-Cola in his blender. Then between 1973 to 76, Chase was forcibly admitted to an institution after being taken to an emergency room for trying to inject rabbit's blood into his veins. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and became known as the Vampire, as he all too often killed animals and drank their blood. But by 1976, he was deemed no longer a threat to society and released back into his mother's custody. Tragically, she began weaning him off his medication, believing that he didn't really need it. And once again, he slipped into evil habits. But this time, it wasn't birds and rabbits Chase was harming, it was breaking into homes and people before treating them just as he did his animals. Eventually, he was put on trial for his 6 victims, and a jury ruled him guilty, rejecting the defense's attempt that he could not be tried due to insanity. Chase was sentenced to death, but ended up taking his own life while behind bars before his execution. Coming in at number 2 is Ed Gein. Also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, this monster was a and body snatcher between 1947 to 1957. Gein grew up very religious. His mother was a devout Lutheran who taught her sons that women were inherently promiscuous and instruments of the devil. Gein became very attached to his mother, a little too much, and after his father and brother both died, she was all he had left. Gein became his mother's primary caregiver after she had a stroke, and then when she died in 1945, something snapped and he became a different person. He began to visit graveyards at night, digging up middle-aged women that had similarities to his deceased mother. He'd then bring the bodies home before mutilating them, using their skin to make covers for his furniture, masks out of their faces, or using the bones for decoration and dishes. Even creepier was when he began creating an entire woman suit from various different exhumed bodies, as he wanted to be able to become his mother and literally be in her skin. After exhuming dead bodies began to feel dull, he started to kill the victims himself. 2 women lost their lives in his hands, both of which were found scattered across his property as furniture pieces, almost as if they were some prized hunting trophy. After his horror house was found by authorities in 1957, he was deemed legally insane and unfit for trial. He spent the rest of his life in an institution for the criminally insane until his death in 1984. And last up today, we have Jim Jones. If you've ever heard of the term drinking the Kool-Aid, this man is why. Growing up, Jones's family life was difficult. His father was a disabled war vet, frequently in and out of hospital, and his mother was all around just neglectful. So Jones was pretty much left to his own devices. Looking for a family, he began to develop a community at his local church, but sadly it turned into a much darker obsession. Soon he began to study and idealize fascists and communist leaders and dreamed of becoming a preacher just like them. As an adult, he worked as a minister and began claiming to have psychic powers, as well as an ability to heal the wounded and sick, until eventually he started his own religion, the People's Temple. Sadly, he became drunk on power, and next thing you know, he was calling himself a prophet and began hoarding the cult members' money for his own gain. By 1977, he immigrated the community to Guyana to live as a commune called Jonestown. But after Congressman Ryan got hint of what was really going on down there, he went to investigate allegations of human rights abuse. The congressman ended up taking members from the cult who expressed their desire to leave. But Jones did not take kindly to this and ordered his henchmen to Ryan and his party. But after he got word that not everyone was taken out, he became afraid that the military would come down and shut down his entire operation. So he ordered that all members take their own lives as an act of revolution. Tragically, all 909 members, many of which were minors, were forced to take their own life with a mix of flavor aid and cyanide. All those that didn't go down willingly were given an injection. Prior to September of 2001, it was the greatest deliberate loss of American civilian life. Well, there you have it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.